Hello, my name is Chris. For 15 years, I've been a specialist driving assessor working at Queen Elizabeth's Foundation for Disabled People and with Driving Mobility, the national charity that coordinates the independent driving and mobility centres across the UK. My everyday role involves assessing and supporting drivers with disabilities and includes the assigning of driving licence restriction codes for these clients, as well as giving advice about the codes to any other people who may contact us. We've been asked by the Department for Transport to produce this video to clarify the driving licence restriction code system in the UK. My aim in this presentation is to briefly explain about driving licence restriction codes to make it easier for you to either assign or interpret the codes. This will help professionals such as driving mobility assessors, approved driving instructors, DVSA driving examiners, Motability personnel and the police. On a basic level, and as a professional involved with driving, you should be aware that driving licences may display numbered restriction codes on the rear of the plastic card. For example, code 01 if the driver needs glasses or contact lenses. There are also a series of vehicle adaptation codes, numbered 10 to 43 for cars, along with other administrative codes and a separate coding list for motorcycles. In this video, we'll be explaining what the car codes mean to help assign and interpret them correctly. It's vital to ensure that drivers have the correct codes on their licences so they're not prevented from using controls they can safely use. It's also important to ensure that drivers are not saddled with unnecessary codes for adaptations that may not be needed for safe driving, but that could result in the driving licence holder driving illegally if they attempt to drive without them. Getting codes removed from a driving licence is a long and arduous process that may even involve the licence holder having to reset their driving tests before DVLA will consider the removal of the unnecessary codes. So it's vitally important for you to assign or advise the correct restriction codes. By understanding the restriction coding system, we can ensure that incorrect and unnecessary codes are not assigned. So let's look at how people may misinterpret the restriction coding system and why this might happen. The restriction codes should be applied based upon the needs of the licence holder, not what adaptation they use or are perceived to require. Think that the restriction code should reflect the standard vehicle controls that cannot be operated due to the driving licence holder's disability. With vehicle modifications, there are only 11 codes that need to be considered. They are numbered between 10 and 43. It's important that you take your time to understand the coding system, as mistakes are easy to make, but very difficult to correct after codes have been assigned. First, remember that driving licence restriction codes mean that the driver must use the control measure that the code refers to. Therefore, consider what needs to be modified because of the driver's physical restriction, the standard controls that can't be operated, rather than the modifications that the driver chooses to use or is using because of a specific adaptation. It's been said that an assessor or examiner can only code for what they've seen the driver demonstrate through an assessment or driving test. This is a misunderstanding of the coding system. A driving licence restriction code means that the driver must use the control measure that the code refers to. Therefore, consider what needs to be modified because of the driver's physical restriction, the standard controls that can't be operated, rather than the modification that the driver chooses to use or is using because a specific adaptation has been chosen. As with any other driver, this might not necessarily reflect all the adaptations that can be used when the driver takes a driving test or assessment. Push-pull hand controls may be the chosen type of hand control, and they would normally be used with a modified indicator and a steering ball, But if there's full function in the upper limbs, there is no actual need to code the steering or secondary controls. The steering ball and indicator pin switch are only used because this design of hand control has been chosen. They're not needed to overcome the lower limb disability. The examiner must ascertain how the candidate's special need impacts their ability to drive and assess the most appropriate adaptation coding. During the course of the practical driving test, the examiner will be assessing what adaptations the candidate uses and whether they actually need them. They will also consider any other adaptation that could assist the candidate with their ability to drive safely and responsibly, avoiding unnecessary coding. There is extra time allocated which should be used to assess the restrictions and necessary modifications. A discussion with their line manager would ensure that there's no evidence of overcoding before submitting the D255 to DVLA. If a driver has restricted function in the lower limbs but full function in the upper limbs, think about the controls that need to be modified, the standard controls that cannot be operated. In this case, the only controls that need to be modified are the accelerator and brake pedals that would need to be operated with some form of hand control. The steering and indicators do not need to be modified because of the driver's disability. They are only being used because this design of hand control has been chosen. Code 35, modified control layout, and Code 40, modified steering, are therefore not required. For push-pull hand controls, modified braking, and modified accelerator, Code 25, would be the correct codes. If the driver has full function in the upper limbs, there is no reason why they should not be able to operate alternative designs of hand control. If a center ring accelerator and brake lever was chosen, the steering is controlled and turned conventionally, so the standard stalk controls would be used and a steering ball would not be required. Code 20, modified braking, and Code 25, modified accelerator, would also be the correct codes for the adaptation. I would also cover other types of hand controls, so would not unnecessarily restrict the driver. Code 32, combining brake and accelerator, only applies when the brake and accelerator needs to be combined. This would normally apply if there's a restriction in the upper limb function and there's a difficulty moving the hand between separate accelerator and brake controls, or it might be required if there's reduced strength in the upper limb and the accelerator and brake needs to be operated electrically. Code 32 should not be used if hand controls are needed and push-pull controls are chosen, but the accelerator and brake does not need to be combined. The driver's need is for an adapted accelerator and an adapted brake, not for a combination of the two. Code 20 and Code 25 should be used if push-pull are chosen. This is very important when the license is coded by a DVSA examiner after a test pass. Code 32 should only be used if a combined control is needed. For example, electric brake and gas, prosthetic limb, operating push-pull hand controls. Code 78 is an administrative code that is used to show that the licence holder passed their driving test in a vehicle with automatic transmission. This will then restrict the licence holder to only drive in automatics, defined as any vehicle with no clutch pedal or lever operated manually. This code should not be used for any other purpose. It is not an adaptation code. Code 10, if a licence holder passes their test in a manual car and subsequently needs to be driving a car with automatic transmission. For example, they lose function in one of their arms because of paralysis or amputation. Then code 10 should be used. This would apply if there was a medical need for automatic selection of gears ratio, a fully automatic gearbox. But code 10 may also be required if an adaptive control device, push-pull button gear selector, is needed. DVSA have stated that if a candidate takes their test in a vehicle with automatic transmission, and code 78 is applied, no additional code would be added if automatic selection of gear ratio was needed. If driving adaptations are required, they are normally fitted to vehicles with automatic transmission. It's very rare for manual cars to be adapted, and it's unlikely that an adapted manual would be used for driving test purposes. It is possible, however, for a right leg amputee to drive a manual car using hand controls for accelerator and brake, and their left foot to operate the standard clutch pedal. This would require code 20 and code 25 to be applied. If the driver has no function in their left leg, they may still drive a manual car. They might be able to still use a standard clutch pedal with a prosthetic limb, even if they don't choose to presently. A code 15 modified clutch may be required on very rare occasions, but only if the user needs a permanent modified clutch. It is possible, however, for a right leg amputee to drive a manual car using hand controls for accelerator and brake, and their left foot to operate the standard clutch pedal. This would require code 20 and 25 to be applied, or alternatively, they may be able to operate the standard accelerator and brake pedals using a prosthetic limb, in which case no code would be required. A left leg amputee may be able to operate a standard clutch pedal with a prosthetic limb, in which case no code is required. Or they could use an electrically operated clutch pedal, which would require code 15 for a permanently modified clutch. Code 25. If a driver has restricted function in their right foot, but there's no problem with their left foot, they could choose to use a left foot accelerator. This adaptation would be the only option for a driver with hemiplegia, with a weakness down one side of the body. If a left foot accelerator is used, the driver would normally also operate the standard brake pedal with a left foot. If restrictive function in the right foot prevents the normal operation of the brake pedal, so long as no adaptation is needed and the standard brake pedal is used, there would be no requirement for a code to be applied. Code 31. Drivers of short stature who can't reach the standard foot pedals may need extended pedals to be fitted to bring the pedals closer to the driver. If a permanently raised floor is required to support the legs, often used with extension pedals, Code 31 would also apply. Code 31 also applies if a pedal guard is required to prevent obstruction or actuation of the accelerator and brake pedals when using hand controls, or prevent the foot not being used for accelerating and braking from moving sideways or interfering with the operation of the pedals. Code 32. Combined service brake and accelerator system has already been described. Code 33 combined brake, accelerator and steering system. This would be used with a high-tech adaptation and typically describes a four-way joystick used to operate, accelerate, brake and steer for drivers who only have function in one limb. Code 35. Modify control layout. If restriction to upper limbs mean that the standard secondary controls cannot be operated and the location of switches needs altering, then this code would apply, code 35. The location of the switches would be to suit the driver, and switches could be operated by any part of the body. Drivers with function in only one hand would normally use a steering ball mounted keypad that they could operate whilst controlling and turning the steering wheel. Code 40, modified steering. Commonly, this would be some form of steering ball or similar type of spinner. Driver has restricted function in their upper limbs and needs to steer with one hand. A steering ball may be needed, and if there's no function in one hand, a secondary control keypad may need to be attached to the steering ball. If there is reduced grip in the steering hand and a more specialised aid may be required, and if there's reduced strength in the arm, additional power assistance may be required. More severe upper limb restriction may require more high-tech steering adaptations, and if there's no function in either arm, the steering could be operated with a foot control. Code 42, modified rear side view devices. This could be a panoramic interior mirror, a blind spot mirror to see alongside the car, or junction view mirrors to see the sides for people with more severe neck restrictions. Camera systems can also be utilised for blind spot and junction view, and reversing cameras help for looking behind the cars. Code 43, driver seating position. If significant modification to the seat height is needed, or if additional thoracic chest support is required to increase stability, this may require coding. Modification to the seatbelt or additional restraint systems, or providing additional support by fitting armrests would also require coding. Minor adaptations such as cushions would not require coding. So there you are. That's a comprehensive list with guidance on how restriction codes should be applied to a driving licence. In summary, always bear in mind that licence restrictions mean that the licence holder must have that control restriction in place. They must only drive using the adaptation to which the restriction refers to. If you're assigning the driving licence restriction codes, take time to think. Must the control be modified? Is the restriction code necessary, and is it correct? I do hope that this has been useful and you can see that assigning and interpreting driving licence restriction codes is simpler than it first appears. You only need to consider what must be modified, what standard control cannot be operated because of the driver's physical disability. Remember that the driving licence is a legal document. It is a serious matter to advise on any restriction code. If in doubt, please seek expert advice. There is more detailed information on the Driver Mobility website, www.drivermobility.org.uk/restriction codes, or email info@drivermobility.org.uk, or telephone 0800 559 36 36. Thank you for watching.